54-го отдельного комендантского Преображенского полка, удостоены звания.
Russia is celebrating Victory Day today. Compared to previous years, though, this year's parade was a scaled-down affair. Apparently, the Russians did not have enough weapons on display. They've launched a fresh wave of strikes on Ukraine. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, a dangerous situation is developing. There is panic in Zaporizhzhia. This is the town that hosts Europe's biggest nuclear power plant, and it has been a battleground through the course of this war. A very dangerous situation, raising a serious risk of nuclear catastrophe. The plant itself has been hit several times. There have been repeated warnings and pleas to stop fighting near this plant, but they've all fallen on deaf ears. Soon after the war began, Russia took control of the nuclear plant. But now it is evacuating its people. Russians living in this area have been told to leave. 18 settlements are being evacuated, 1-8. We're talking about tens of thousands of Russians. They're leaving amid growing anxiety. There are fears of a quote-unquote severe nuclear accident. That's the assessment of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's the nuclear watchdog of the United Nations, and it has sounded a fresh warning. The evacuations are happening in this area, in southern Ukraine, in Zaporizhzhia. This region has many towns and villages. Russia controls a part of this area. Last week, local Russian officials issued instructions. They said 18 towns and villages must be evacuated. Why? Apparently, the fighting is about to intensify here. The order said that Ukraine is trying to break through Russian defenses, so people here must leave. How many people? At least 70,000, according to one estimate. As you can imagine, this has led to chaos and panic, especially in this town. It's called Enerhodar. It's close to the nuclear plant. Many people who work at the plant live here. The IAEA says evacuations have begun in Enerhodar. Let me in fact quote from their report. The general situation in the area near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is becoming increasingly unpredictable and potentially dangerous. We must act now to prevent the threat of a severe nuclear accident and its associated consequences for the population and the environment. Now, this is as clear as a warning gets, and recent developments bear this out. Reports say there's been regular shelling over the past week. IAEA experts are unable to visit this area. It's not clear what's happening at the plant. According to the IAEA, the operating staff is still there, and they're doing what they can to ensure safety, but they're operating in very difficult circumstances. To give you an idea, let me take you back to an old interview. 2 months back, the chief of the IAEA visited this plant. His name is Rafael Grossi. He said he had to cross a minefield to get to the plant. And remember, this is a nuclear power plant, and there are mines around it. Listen to what he said.
I was able to make an assessment of the damage that the plant sustained, especially on the attacks and the shelling on November 20th, which was quite severe. So that was for me quite important to have a look at that. These affected 2 reactors. So there is, wittingly or unwittingly, reactors were hit, or the buildings of the reactors were hit or in the vicinity. So this is very serious. This is very serious.
And what is the situation at the plant? Reports say the reactors are not producing electricity, but they're still loaded with nuclear material. The plant's power lines are damaged. It is running on diesel generators. This keeps the cooling systems online. And you don't have to be a nuclear scientist to know that this is a very dangerous situation to be in. The latest reports say gas stations in the area are running dry. Grocery stores have empty shelves and ATMs are out of cash. And that's not all. The Ukrainian army is conducting radiation drills. Basically, they're preparing for a nuclear disaster.
As we are amid a full-scale invasion, the risk of a chemical or nuclear attack by the enemy is always there. That's why we are trained to detect toxic substances and radiation levels. We have received up-to-date equipment that is much better than our previous devices.
Neither Russia nor Ukraine can afford to ignore this. If disaster strikes, both sides will be responsible, and both sides will suffer losses. Incidentally, Russia is celebrating Victory Day today to mark their victory over Nazi Germany in the Second World War. A march was held on Russia's Red Square. Nuclear weapons were on display. President Vladimir Putin gave a speech. He used the occasion to defend the war.
We are proud of the participants in the special military operation, of all those who are fighting on the front line, who provide support under fire, who rescue the wounded. There is nothing more important now than your own combat effort. The security of the country rests on you today. The future of our statehood and our people depend on you. You are fulfilling your military duty with honor. You are fighting for Russia.
Meanwhile, Ukraine is getting more military aid, equipment worth $1.2 billion from the US. The package will include air defense systems, ammunition, and funds for training. Reports say Ukraine is preparing for a counteroffensive. It could be launched soon, but if the situation in Zaporizhzhia worsens, Ukraine might be forced to deal with a different crisis altogether, a nuclear catastrophe. Canada's neighbor, the US, is in trouble. The government is about to run out of money. Team Biden is warning about a constitutional crisis. The US could potentially default on its debts. The deadline is the 1st of June. An economic crisis looms, but American lawmakers are dragging their heels. In the next 4 minutes, we'll fill you in on the latest. President Joe Biden is short on time. His government needs money, else it could default on its debts. Biden's Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has issued warnings. Treasury Secretary is the finance minister of the US, and Yellen says the stability of the American economy is at risk.
It's Congress's job to do this. If they fail to do it, we will have an economic and financial catastrophe that will be of our own making. And there is no action that President Biden and the U.S. Treasury can take to prevent that catastrophe.
A catastrophe, she says. And this is not really a new problem in the US. This has to do with their debt ceiling. It's one of the most divisive issues in American politics. Washington has had this problem for years now, and it's not been able to find a permanent solution. Let me explain. Every government needs money. They need money to run schemes, to pay bills, to pay salaries, and all kinds of expenses. Where do they get this money? They take a loan. They raise a debt. All governments do it. But in America, they set a limit to this. It's called the debt ceiling. It's a limit on how much money the government can borrow. Do you know what's the current limit? $31.4 trillion. So the Biden government cannot borrow beyond this sum. Now, $31.4 trillion may seem like a lot of money, but for the US government, it's not enough. They're about to hit this limit very soon, meaning the government's borrowing is set to touch $31.4 trillion very soon. They won't be able to borrow beyond this. So how will they run the country? That is the crisis at hand. It's a bit like having a credit card. Say you have a card. You can use it whenever you want to buy whatever you want. But the card has a limit. Beyond that figure, you cannot spend. That is your credit limit. Now, what happens if you want to spend more than this? You go to the bank and you ask the bank for a higher credit limit. That's how it works. Now, think of the Biden administration with a similar credit card. They're about to touch their limit. For them, the bank is the US Congress, and the bankers are the Republicans, the opposition party. If Biden wants to borrow more cash, he will have to convince the Republicans. They must agree to raising the credit limit, or the debt ceiling as they call it. And that is the biggest stumbling block. If you know US politics, you would know that Democrats and Republicans oppose each other on most issues, and this is one of them. So Republicans are not ready to raise the debt ceiling, and Biden is furious. He says they're forcing the US into a default.
Our MAGA Republicans in Congress are threatening to do all this progress by letting us, quote, default on the debt unless we agree to their demands. They're trying to hold the debt hostage to us to agree to some draconian cuts, magnificently difficult. We're not a deadbeat nation. We pay our bills.
Now, why won't the Republicans allow Biden to top up the government's credit card? Because they sense an opportunity here. They want to score political points and they want to make Democrats pay. So they're pushing hard on budget cuts. They want Joe Biden to make sacrifices. Last month, Republicans demanded a meeting with the president.
He's putting the American economy in jeopardy by his lack of action. Now he should sit down and negotiate.
Well, they've got their wish. Biden is meeting them today. The goal is to break the deadlock. But the president also laid down some rules before the meeting.
There shouldn't be negotiations on the debt limit. This is something that they should get to regular order and get to work on. We should not have House Republicans manufacturing a crisis on something that has been done 78 times since 1960. This is their constitutional duty. Congress must act. That's what the president's going to make very clear with the leaders tomorrow.
So Biden wants more debt without any strings attached. Well, that's not sitting well with his political rivals. They say the government cannot engage in uninterrupted borrowing. There has to be a limit. As it is, the US government has the biggest debt pile in the world. It's about to cross $31 trillion. Republicans say Biden should bring this debt under control. They're pushing for budget cuts. What happens if they fail to break the deadlock? What happens if the debt ceiling is not raised? Well, the US government could shut down and the US economy could suffer a blow. The Treasury Secretary says the country could be pushed towards a crisis.
There is no way to protect our financial system and our economy other than Congress doing its job and raising the debt ceiling and enabling us to pay our bills. And we should not get to the point where we need to consider whether the president can go on issuing debt. This would be a constitutional crisis.
The clock is ticking for President Biden. Will he push the Republicans for a deal or will he settle for a compromise? We'll have to wait and see. Brace yourselves, because for our next story, I'm about to womansplain. I'll be talking about money, the one thing that makes the world go round, which is no secret. But who knows this best? Banks. They refine the art of not only making money, but also saving it. And you know where a chunk of their savings come from? The pockets of their employees. To be specific, the pockets of their female employees. And this is my cue to talk about Goldman Sachs. It's a leading global investment bank based in the American city of New York. It knows exactly how to make money, but paying it is another matter altogether. Goldman Sachs has a massive gender pay gap. What is that? It's the difference between the money earned by women and men. That's a pay gap. It shows inequality between the genders. And it is jarring across the world. I'll talk more about it later. For now, let's focus on Goldman Sachs. What do you think its pay gap is? Take a wild guess. 20%, 25%, 30%. The answer is 53.2%. Simply put, men at Goldman Sachs make more than double of what the women make. 53.2%. For the same work, may I remind you, imagine if you earn less than half the money your peers do, despite doing the same work and having the same educational background, despite bringing the same value to the company. Would you be okay with it? Probably not. None of us would. And that applies to the female employees of Goldman Sachs too. They first sued the bank over pay gap in the year 2010. Then, over the years, more cases piled up. We're talking about almost 2,800 such cases. 2,800 women spoke up against the bank and finally they won. The lawsuit has been settled. Goldman Sachs has been ordered to shell out $215 million, which is a lot of money and good news. But a trial, we say, would have been better. The bank practically raced to settle this before the trial could begin. And we say a trial would have been better because it would have been a rare public forum, a testimony of unfair treatment of women workers. Because this problem is not limited to this bank or to the banking sector. It's a problem that exists across industries, across countries. It's a vastly accepted daylight robbery. Worldwide, women make only 77 cents to every dollar earned by men, which means a woman works full-time for a salary that is only 77% of a man's salary. In other words, women end up working for free for more than 10 weeks every year. It sounds a bit unhinged, right? Yet the world over, we seem to be okay with it. Gender gap exists across countries. No country has been able to close it yet, but some are faring better than others. Iceland and Finland top the list. They have closed at least 85% of their gap. Which countries are doing the worst? Syria, Pakistan, Iraq, Yemen and Afghanistan. In fact, you can remove Afghanistan because women aren't allowed to work there anymore, so there's no question of pay. What about India? India ranks at 140 out of 156 countries, which is not a great place to be. Now, the pay gap is bad enough. Do you know what's worse? Attempts to justify it or to say progress has been made. I'll tell you how much progress has been made. In 1996, women were earning 75 cents to the white man's $1. Today, they make 77 cents. If 2 cents in over 2 decades is your idea of progress, then well, congratulations. The thing is, you can work hard, but you cannot outperform inequality. No matter how you slice the data, you will see that a pay gap exists. It is not a myth, and it won't go away until you fight it. Now let's talk about another country struggling with repression. This one, however, might just escape its oppressors. We're talking about Thailand. It goes to polls on Sunday, and its leader, former General turned Prime Minister Prayut Chan-O-Cha, might be on his way out. Chan-O-Cha led a coup in 2014, and he's been in charge since. Reports say his rule has been unpopular, but that's no guarantee of his ouster on Sunday, because Prayut Chan-O-Cha has two important allies, Thailand's military and the monarchy. The military in particular has been accused of having rigged the election in his favor. You see, Thailand has election rules that make it extremely difficult to form a civilian government. And even if by some stroke of luck, civilian rule does return, there's always the risk of another coup. Here's a report. Voting has begun in Thailand. The election is on Sunday. These are early voters lining up to have their say as their country sits on the cusp of change.
I want the new generation to be running the country. I want to try something new.
Something new may not be music to the ears of this man, Prayut Chan-O-Cha, General turned Prime Minister. He's been in power since 2014, fighting for another term and trying to project a friendlier face. But this is not how most people see him. Chan-O-Cha is known to rule with strict military discipline. He was the chief of the Royal Thai Army before he seized power in a coup. That was in May 2014. He ousted Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra. She's the sister of Thaksin Shinawatra. Thaksin too was a prime minister, and he too was removed in a coup back in 2006. Yes, coups are quite common in Thailand. So Chan-O-Cha rode the anti-government sentiment to take power in 2014. 5 years later, an election was held, and he won. But this election will be tougher. Opinion polls say Chan-O-Cha's party is headed for a crushing defeat. But of course, military leaders rarely give up power easily. And it's no different in Thailand. In 2017, they changed election laws to suit the military. The new law says the Prime Minister doesn't have to be a member of Parliament. So even if Chan-O-Cha loses from his seat, he could still return to power. In fact, the Prime Minister doesn't even have to be a member of the winning party or coalition. So in theory, 20 different parties can say they'll make Chan-O-Cha the Prime Minister if they win, and that's allowed. But that's not even the most insidious part. To become Prime Minister, you need a majority in both houses of Parliament. They have a total of 750 seats. Out of these, 250 are appointed by the military. So it's nearly impossible to win without their support. And yet, Chan-O-Cha may lose. His opponents are polling far ahead of him. His key challenger is a member of the Shinawatra clan. the daughter of former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, the one who was removed from office in 2006. And she's ahead by a huge margin. But even if she wins, the road ahead won't be easy for her. Her family has been at the receiving end of multiple coups.
I'm not the one who invented a coup d'etat or anything, but actually, I have a very high hope that it's not going to happen again. And I believe that it's going to be harder, a lot harder, that the coup will happen again.
Quite optimistic. For the sake of democracy, let's hope she's right. The sky is blue, the grass is green, and Italians love their pasta. All three statements are completely true. Our last story tonight is about the last one. In Italy, pasta is a cultural phenomenon, an art form, a love affair. But now the country is having some serious pasta problems. In fact, their government says it's having a pasta crisis, more specifically, a crisis of soaring pasta prices. They've surged almost twice as much as the country's inflation rate. We'll tell you why. Also, how this impacts Italian families for whom pasta is a staple, and the world that continues to depend on Italy for this culinary favorite. Here's a report.
Italy is in crisis, one that's simmering in marinara sauce, lots of cheese, and inflation. The country has serious pasta problems. The words definitely have a nice ring to them, but it's no laughing matter. Italians are the world's biggest consumers of pasta. They eat about 1.4 million tons of pasta a year. That's about 23 kilograms of pasta per person per year. This is the country's favorite food. But favoritism can't save it from soaring prices, which have jumped by double the national inflation rate. There has been a rise of 17.5% in pasta prices within a year, while overall inflation in the country stands at 8.8%. So you can understand that this is a serious matter for Italy, enough to demand a crisis meeting. The country's industry minister, Adolfo Urso, has called for one. It'll be held on May 11th. The talks aim to look for solutions and monitor these unusual price movements. And we say about time, because pasta has been facing price pressures for the past few years now. It has only been accelerated by rising inflation, which was the highest in more than a decade by the end of the year. But why is this inflation affecting pasta so much? Because of the hit wheat crops took. A specific type of wheat is used to make pasta. It's called the durum wheat. In Europe, its prices increased by 75% in 2021. This came after a drought in Canada, which is a major exporter of this crop. And speaking of drought, Italy also faced the brunt of extreme weather last year. There were agricultural losses of about $2 billion. A dire situation for Italian farmers. All in all, a perfect storm for pasta. And it's affecting not just Italy, but the rest of the world too. About 61% of pasta produced in Italy is exported, 65% of which is destined for Europe, the remaining to the rest of the world. So prices of pasta are increasing in a number of countries. In the UK too, the price of pasta has doubled. In the US, it has increased by about 37%. But pasta is not the only Italian food under attack. Enjoying pizza in Italy is becoming difficult too. The cost of pizza has risen by 30% within a year. Now, what is pizza made of? Flour, tomatoes, mozzarella cheese, and olive oil. The cost of all these things has been rising, especially olive oil. Its price has risen by 30%. The world is feeling the sting of these prices, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to enjoy Italian cuisine. The country is known to guard the sanctity of its food. No ketchup in pasta, no chicken or pineapple on pizza. But little did Italy know that something much bigger could become its food's worst enemy: inflation, which is no purist and preys on all food alike. No discrimination whatsoever. So for now, Italy's hopes rest on the upcoming talks this week, because its people continue to brave a culinary crisis, where what the taste buds want, the wallet can't afford.
And finally, it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Starting with the Democratic Republic of Congo, the country is dealing with the aftermath of devastating floods. More than 400 people have been killed. Search and rescue operations are still on. Meanwhile, NASA has launched 2 satellites to monitor cyclones. And finally, swimmers from around the world participated in a swimming competition in Bolivia. They endured cold temperatures and high altitude. Also, what makes the 9th of May significant? Taking you back in history, we told you that Russia marked the Victory Day today. The day commemorates the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany. It's a day of celebration for Russians. But interestingly, it wasn't always the case. The Soviet population apparently believed that there was little to celebrate. Victory had been achieved, but it came at a huge cost. In Europe, it was a day of mourning and introspection. The day slowly became about gusto and flair with each passing year, and Putin took the celebrations to new heights. We're leaving you with these visuals. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Three, two, one.
Email exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony. The US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.